Did you know that in Kerbal Space Program, if you choose the desert airfield as your launch location, and then head on over to the flagpole and what I assume is the mission control facility, you will find this! It's a little Easter egg that was added in one of the later updates of the game, 1.12. What it depicts is the Goddard 1, Robert H. Goddard's first liquid-fueled rocket that successfully launched in March 1926, marking, among many other achievements, the first ever flight of a liquid-fueled rocket. The flight wasn't exactly orbital, it lasted mere seconds and reached an apogee of 12.5 meters. Despite its modest scale, it proved the viability of liquid-fueled rockets and paved the way for the modern machines of today. And to this day, Robert Goddard is considered the father of modern rocketry. There's just one weird thing about this. It's back to front. The engine is at the top with the fuel tanks underneath, and this was due to the erroneous belief that this configuration would allow the rocket to hang from the engine like a pendulum, keeping the rocket stable during flight. Intuitively, this makes sense, right? Holding a stick from the top is easier than from the bottom, but this is incorrect when it comes to rockets. A pendulum is anchored at a fixed point, and any swinging movement is a rotation around this static pivot. A rocket isn't attached to anything, whether the engine is placed at the top or the bottom. If the rocket begins to tilt, the engine doesn't pull it upright or stabilize it, the engine's just going to continue firing along the direction the rocket is already pointing. And from a plumbing and thermal perspective, having the engines at the bottom of the rocket makes a lot more sense than at the top. The closest thing modern rockets have to a true common ancestor is probably the German V2. It's got the fuel tanks at the top and the engine at the bottom, and it was the first ever human-made vehicle to cross the Karman line and reach space. And you can recreate it in Kerbal Space Program with the mod Completely Non-Aggressive Rocketry, which adds the parts to build it in the game. I'm a big history nerd and I wanted to have a go with this mod, but I feel that I can't go further without acknowledging the reasons for the V2's existence. I'm assuming you all know the history of the V2, and that while it certainly paved the way for legendary vehicles like the Saturn V and all the other rockets that came after, it itself was not really a thing to be celebrated. V2 stands for Vengeance Weapon 2 and was developed in Nazi Germany during the Second World War with the explicit purpose of attacking Allied cities in retaliation to the bombing of German cities, causing the deaths of an estimated 9,000 military personnel and civilians, and 12,000 labourers and concentration camp workers died building the V2s. However, after the war, the United States began relocating German rocket scientists to America in September 1945, including principal designer of the V2, Wernher von Braun, along with 300 railcar loads of V2s and parts. It was launched multiple times from the States, one of those launches being the very first rocket launch from Cape Canaveral, and instead of a warhead, it carried scientific payloads, which were included in the mod too, meaning that we can recreate the post-war and peaceful use that the V2 rocket served. So let's have a look at the parts in more detail. Okay, so the V2 was a pretty simple rocket, so building it with the mod doesn't take very long. So we're going to start off with this. This is the TTOV X005 guidance unit. This is obviously the kind of probe core, I guess. We then have the first of our fuel tanks, and then we have the second of our fuel tanks. Now in the game, these are both liquid fuel and oxidizer tanks, but in reality, this would be the fuel tank, which was an alcohol-water mixture, and then this would be the liquid oxygen tank. And then we have our engine, which we can then surround with some aerodynamic control surfaces. Let's try and get these angled correctly. Oh, how do I get these to line up properly? Let's try that one more time. Let's just stick them onto this fuel tank and offset them down. And that looks pretty good. So the only thing we have left to do now is the nose cone. So with this mod, we either have this. This is kind of like the stand-in for a warhead. So what I've built here is essentially the Nazi wartime, weapon of destruction V2, or we can go for a little decoupler to build the scientific version. If we're going to do the scientific version, we can actually change the color scheme from V2 to bumper, so we can accurately recreate the American version that was used for experiments. Now we have a few options available to us. We have this that can go on the top. This is like a little engine to which we can add a few things. We have 3 science experiments. We have a Capella barometer, we have a goo experiment, and we have a thermometer. And aesthetically, these are all exactly the same. And yeah, as you can see, it's a fairly small rocket. The mod creator intended this to be an early career rocket rather than something you would use kind of late game. To give you a sense of scale, if I just remove this top stage here, and find, if I just turn off my mod filter here, and find a stock part to give you a sense of scale, let's put the basic command pod on top. As you can see, it's pretty massive compared to the scale of the rockets. You're not going to be putting any Kerbals into orbit with this thing. But what's interesting, if I just disable the squad parts again, is this engine here, along with a science experiment of your choosing. This was the very first two-stage rocket ever launched. Obviously, the original V1 was just the single... Let's get it back there. Was just the single-stage bomb, basically. But here, it launched up, and then with this tiny little rocket, it's not got much delta V. Let's sort our staging out so you can see. If we just place it as its own craft, we can see it has 117 meters per second, which does admittedly go up slightly to 127 when we launch at altitude/vacuum, or vacuum level I should say. But yeah, it doesn't have a great deal of range. It also has no probe control, so all it does is just sends the scientific payload, I guess, above the Karman line or on a slightly elongated trajectory to what the current rocket was on. But here is our V2 bumper rocket on the launch pad, ready for our maiden flight. So let's go ahead and just set all the UI up, I guess, and get ready to launch. And there goes the first flight of our bumper rocket. Now, I didn't realize this till it came to actually editing all the footage and then narrating over that. When I realized I didn't actually completely build this rocket properly. The upper stage, that tiny little spindly thing at the top, is supposed to have 4 very small fins around it, much like the grid fins, much like the stabilization fins at the base of the V2. I just forgot to add them somehow. So if you decide to download this mod, then don't forget to do that. Anyway, we have finished burning our first stage. So now it's time to stage. I want to try and get ourselves as high as possible before firing that upper stage, which I think is about to happen in just a second. There it goes. Oh, great. We've launched it. Let's switch to it and see if we can get some science out of it. And that's when I realized I couldn't switch to it. It didn't have a probe core inside, and so it was just coming up as debris. And because both vessels are in atmosphere, I can't switch to it. So we're going to have to just chalk this up as a bit of a failed launch attempt, unfortunately. So, yeah, kind of a disappointing start to our bumper program, but we are talking about the very early days of rocket science and space flight and, you know, rocket launches. They weren't going to be perfect. So, you know, we ended up kind of making basically a V2 bomb, and we nearly bombed the pyramids. I've never actually seen the pyramids before. They're in the background there. It's like an Easter egg location. So very nearly destroyed an ancient, you know, monument there. But it was all fine. I was unable to switch to the, air quotes now, debris, but it was just too late at that point, so I couldn't do any science. So before doing our next launch, I added a really, really small nano satellite, you know, component to the upper stage. This is from the CNAR mod, which I covered in my last Kerbal Space Program video. It was the only probe core I had that would fit basically within the profile of that upper stage. All of the stock probes are too small. So here we go, launch number 2 of our bumper rocket. And yeah, this one was much, much, much more successful. So we're going to try and run our scientific experiment that we've got at the very tip of our second stage. The first one we're going to try and get, well, we're going to burn through the V2 stage, which is now complete. We're then going to just coast our way up to kind of not quite apogee, because if we're going at apogee, the rocket will have started tipping over. So about now, we're going to launch that upper stage. And yes, lo and behold, we can switch to it, which means that I can right-click that science experiment at some point. I guess I'm just waiting until the stage burns out and we get to the highest point. The problem is, guys, I recorded all this footage yesterday, and then I edited it all together, and I'm sitting down today, a whole day later, and I can't quite remember everything I did. At the moment, I'm sort of crunching, because I'm going to Germany, and so I need to have a couple of Kerbal Space Program videos pre-created. Normally I'm like creating 1 Kerbal video a week. I've had to make 3, so it's been a bit of a crunch period for me at Lowne Aerospace. So yeah, going a bit crazy looking at Kerbal Space Program all day. But there we are. We observed the mystery goo, and then we can right click it and transmit it down to the ground. So the real bumper program, they could transmit, well, they transmitted all the data basically. They could have recovered it, but they felt that they would just transmit it all during flight. One thing that's quite interesting is that the V2 rocket itself, they purposefully blew it up during descent, not to completely destroy it, but just to damage it so that it would end up having kind of a more drag basically. Its terminal velocity would be lower, because rather than being a lovely aerodynamic shape, it would just be a big mangled metal mess. Can't really do that in Kerbal Space Program, but there you go. And yeah, that concludes the second flight. And that's pretty much where this mod ends in terms of what you can do. It just goes straight up, straight down. But this is Lowne Aerospace, where we play for keeps. And I'm like, what kind of V2 rocket could we make to get a Kerbal from the ground all the way to a stable low Kerbin orbit? So I've had to make a few changes from the normal V2 design. First of all, I've made the actual length of the core slightly longer. One core, though, is not going to be sufficient to get ourselves into low Kerbin orbit, so I've had to surround that core with 4 additional elongated cores, and around those I have placed 4 of the standard length. And the cores feed from outer cores to inner cores. They feed into each other via an onion style setup. So it's a bit like asparagus, but not quite as complicated, just to make things as fuel efficient as possible. So this is not a realistic rocket by any means, not least because of the fact that poor old Bill Karman there is just sitting on a lawn chair at the top of that kind of spiky upper stage. But look at that, the rocket is off. As you can see, our liquid fuel is draining very, very rapidly because, again, this is using fuel cross-feed. So the first fuel tank is going to run out very quickly, and then the rate of depletion of the fuel will decrease as we continue to stage. As you can see, this thing doesn't fly particularly well. The avionics modules don't really provide a great deal of SAS authority, so I am relying on the tail fins there. The V2, which obviously is not going to make much of a... It's not really going to help us when we're in the vacuum of space or in the very, very high parts of the atmosphere. So I've added 4 Werner engines to the nose cone of the central core to provide some kind of attitude control. So yeah, as mentioned, this is not a very realistic rocket by either 1940s standards or by modern standards, because of the fact that we have that fuel crossfeed, which doesn't exist on real rockets. I mean, it kind of existed in one way with the space shuttle, but not like it is here. Like, people always use the space shuttle as the gotcha, even though it's not really the same. Anyway, we are rapidly approaching orbit. Well, we're approaching space. Ready? We're going to cross the Karman line. There we are. Ironically, this is the first V2 I've built in this video, which crossed the Karman line. Now we can perform our circularization burn. It's going to be a long old burn. I didn't do a particularly efficient flight, because if I did a standard gravity turn, Bill Karman probably would have overheated, sitting on the nose just there. So I did a very kind of steep ascent, just so that Bill Karman isn't exposed to too high a velocity, too low in the atmosphere, and, you know, subsequently burn up. And then, aha! Here is something I've prepared ahead of time. I left a re-entry capsule in low Kerbin orbit because I did experiment seeing if Bill could survive re-entry using his lawn chair and or that upper stage as a sort of makeshift heat shield. But unfortunately, even with a really, really not steep re-entry profile, he would always overheat and explode. So I've got a re-entry capsule, which I decided erroneously to reach by using the upper stage of the rocket, which, as you can see, it's not particularly balanced. You know, the center of mass and the center of thrust, they're not lined up whatsoever. So I started doing some puffs, but then I thought, you know what? I did actually prepare for such an eventuality. And by such an eventuality, I mean I tried doing something stupid and then couldn't follow through with the mission. And that is the re-entry capsule is actually just a little rocket in its own right. It's got fuel tanks, it's got RCS, and it's got a probe core, so it can do the rendezvous with Bill Karman should we not be able to do it with the bumper rocket. So yeah, I kind of clock faded through the creation of the maneuver node because, you know, it's not really that interesting, and you've seen me make loads of maneuver nodes on this channel at this point. But I guess, you know, with the, well, we're not quite there yet. Are we nearly at our rendezvous point? There we are, we're burning relative to target, so we're going at 0 meters per second relative to Bill Karman. So I'm just moving the camera around, trying to locate our poor space frog. There it is, there. So we can get him off the command seat and just have him EVA pack over to the re-entry module. So there we go. But with that, we are no longer... That's the end of kind of me showcasing the V2 and bumper rocket parts of this mod. So I hope you enjoyed it. Like I say, this is really... This mission I'm doing now, specifically, I mean, is absolutely not the intended purpose of this mod pack. The mod pack is there to kind of give you some early science experiments to run in like an early career mode, because again, it has the barometer, thermometer, mystery goo experiments, all packaged in a fairly cheap and small suborbital rocket, kind of mimicking the early career of America's space industry, I guess. And I guess it's a slightly more realistic rocket to start out with because it's a robotic rocket, right? You're not launching crew straight away, so it kind of makes the progression a little bit more realistic. But yeah, I see the ground looming into view, which means that the video is almost over. I hope it was enjoyable. I was a bit anxious about covering a rocket like this, to be honest, because of the dark history of the V2. But it is an incredibly key part of the history of general rocketry. I do try and keep these videos lighthearted and upbeat, but I don't for a minute want this to be misconstrued as me downplaying the seriousness of the subject, which is why I chose to start the video with a bit of the history of this vehicle before we launched straight into the mod itself. But I don't want to end the video on too somber a note, so let's end on a song instead. A song that I know is going to get mentioned in the comments anyway, by Tom Lehrer, about principal designer of the V2, Wernher von Braun.
And what is it that put America in the forefront of the nuclear nations? And what is it that will make it possible to spend $20 billion of your money to put some clown on the moon? Well, it was good old American know-how, that's what. As provided by good old Americans like Dr. Wernher von Braun. Gather round while I sing you of Wernher von Braun, a man whose allegiance is ruled by expedience. Call him a Nazi, he won't even frown. Nazi schmatzi, says Wernher von Braun. Don't say that he's hypocritical, say rather that he's apolitical. Once the rockets are up, who cares where they come down? That's not my department, says Wernher von Braun. Some have harsh words for this man of renown, but some think our attitude should be one of gratitude, like the widows and cripples in old London town, who owe their large pensions to Wernher von Braun. You too may be a big hero, once you've learned to count backwards to 0. In German or English, I know how to count down. Und I'm learning Chinese, says Wernher von Braun.